Hi, I'm Mike Joyner, and I'm a professor of anesthesiology and physiology at the Mayo Clinic. As part of the course, I'm going to talk to you today about the 2 hour marathon and use the discussion of the 2 hour marathon as a template to talk about issues in human performance, both historical issues and contemporary issues, and hopefully provide you with a framework to think about human performance into the future. I'm also hopeful that my talk will stimulate questions for your own research or for your own interest, and for those of you who work with athletes, help you do a little bit better job or provide some insights for your work with athletes. It's great to get back to talking about human performance because during the last year and a half during the pandemic, my lab has refocused on something called convalescent plasma for COVID-19. And it really is just the last few months that we've gotten back to our sort of normal human physiology and integrated physiology work. And it's terrific to be talking about the marathon, especially after the wonderful performances by Eliud Kipchoge on the men's side and the three women at the Olympics in Tokyo a couple of weeks ago. So I think it's great again to be thinking about human performance. Hopefully the pandemic will be over soon and we'll all get back to our sort of day jobs and focused on helping people go faster, higher, and get stronger. Thanks much.
Hi, my name is Mike Joyner, and today I'm going to talk about the 2 hour marathon and what limits human performance. Here is an overview of the talk and the learning objectives. I'm going to talk about current events, where did my ideas about the 2 hour marathon come from, the physiology of marathon running, some history of marathon running, talk about technology and innovation, including doping, talk a little bit about mental preparation and psychology, and then at the end I'm going to try to put all of this together. Next, I'm going to go over some current events. This slide just reminds us that in May 2017, as part of the Nike Breaking 2 project, the great Eliud Kipchoge ran 2 hours and 25 seconds. At that time, the official world record was 2:02:57, and his very fast time was facilitated by a loop course, pacers and drafting, and the new Nike Vaporfly shoes. A little over a year later, Mr. Kipchoge set a, quote, real world record, unquote, of 2:01:39 at the Berlin Marathon. In 2019, the Ineos 159 project, which was very similar to the Nike Breaking 2 project, occurred. And during that effort, Mr. Kipchoge ran 1:59:40 in Vienna, Austria in October of 2019. This effort, again, included a highly controlled course, pacers, drafting, and the special shoes. The next day at Chicago, Bridget Kosgei ran 2:14:04 to break the women's world record, again by about 80 seconds. This was not a special course, but she was paced throughout most of the race, and she also had the new shoes. As the reference list shows, I've been thinking about the 2 hour marathon for some time, and in fact published my first paper on this concept in 1991. So the question is, where did my ideas about 2 hours come from? In the late 1970s, I ran track and field at the University of Arizona and was lucky enough to be recruited to be a subject in Dr. Pete Farrell's dissertation. His dissertation focused on plasma lactate accumulation and distance running performance. Dr. Ed Coyle also helped Pete, and the study was conducted in the lab of Dr. Jack Wilmore. You can see the main finding from Pete's dissertation here. On the x-axis you see marathon velocity, and on the y-axis you see the velocity at the anaerobic threshold or lactate threshold, and you can see that there's a strong correlation. This correlation held from recreational runners who were running just under 4 hours, all the way to elites who were running under 2 hours and 20 minutes. Fast forward about 10 years, and I started to think about the limits of human performance and began to ask questions about what would happen if a single person had the highest VO2 max ever recorded, the highest lactate threshold ever recorded, and the best running economy ever observed. I then made this model, which I published in the Journal of Applied Physiology in the early 1990s. And the fastest time predicted for this model was just under 2 hours, 1 hour, 57 minutes, and 58 seconds. In the rest of the talk, I'm going to go over where some of these ideas came from in more detail, and also relate them to the history and physiology of marathon running in specific and distance running more generally. As thinking about the 2-hour marathon continued, in the middle 2010s, Sandra Hunter, Andy Jones, and myself started to ask what the 2-hour equivalent was for women, and we concluded that Paula Radcliffe's 2:15:25 set in the early 2000s was pretty close when you consider sex differences in physiology. Again, we'll discuss some of these issues as the talk progresses. So the first question is, what was really known or unknown in the early 1990s and in the late 1980s when I began to think about the 2-hour marathon? We knew a lot about VO2 max and the lactate threshold by then. We did not know nearly so much about running economy, and that's still true. We knew that fatigue is a complicated thing, and as is currently the case, there's limited data on true elites, lots of data on really good sub-elite runners, but not so much on true elites. And we did not know much of anything about the genetics of human performance. So now let's look at the physiology of endurance performance with a focus on the marathon. The physiology of marathon performance is pretty straightforward. First, most of the energy required comes from aerobic sources, and we need to then ask ourselves, what are the determinants of so-called performance velocity? And they simply reflect interactions between maximal oxygen uptake, the lactate threshold, which is the fraction of maximal oxygen uptake that can be sustained for hours, and running economy, the speed that can be generated at this oxygen consumption. In other words, maximal oxygen uptake times lactate threshold sets the performance VO2, and running economy lets us know how fast we can go for a given performance VO2. This is a schematic of maximal oxygen uptake. A high maximal oxygen uptake requires that oxygen be removed from the air and delivered to the skeletal muscle. To do this, you need high levels of minute ventilation, pulmonary diffusing capacity, high cardiac output, lots of oxygen carrying capacity or red blood cells in the circulation, and you need to deliver that oxygen to the skeletal muscles where it diffuses into the mitochondria and is used. On the right side, you see treadmill speed versus VO2 and VCO2. This is in a champion runner with a VO2 max greater than 80 mLs per kg per minute, and you can see that in this individual, in the yellow, you have nearly a 6-liter VO2 max with a running speed of 25 kilometers per hour. And you can also see that VCO2 exceeds VO2 at the very highest workloads. This figure simply shows a linear relationship between cardiac output and VO2 max across a wide range of values. It also, on the right, shows the similar but not quite as tight correlation between red cell volume and VO2 max. I'm not showing you anything on the relationship between skeletal muscle mitochondria and VO2 max, but it's in the paper in the reference list, and the important thing to recognize is that the relationship between skeletal muscle mitochondrial content and VO2 max is not nearly as tight as these relationships are. In the last slide, I showed you the relationship between cardiac output and VO2 max. This slide is a schematic showing that in athletes with 6 liter per minute VO2 maxes, cardiac output is around 36 liters per minute, and the vast majority of that cardiac output is going to skeletal muscles. The same is also true for control or average subjects. However, their cardiac outputs are much lower, and as a result, their skeletal muscle blood flow is lower, and thus their VO2 max is lower. The take-home messages for maximal oxygen uptake are pretty straightforward, and I'll show you later that very high values were reported in elite athletes in the 1930s. You only need limited training to get very high VO2 max values, and you of course know this more recently because of the interest in high-intensity interval training. We know that high cardiac output and high skeletal muscle blood flows are really a requirement for very high VO2 max values, and a lot of this has to do with cardiac stroke volume and also red cell mass. Twin studies also tell us that in response to a standard adult fitness style training program, there's a 5 to 50% increase in VO2 max with about a 0.7 correlation coefficient between identical twins. I mentioned earlier that marathon running is mostly aerobic, and this is a classic figure from Dave Kossel, published in 1970, showing competitive running distance among a number of elite U.S. male distance runners on the x-axis versus lactic acid in milligrams percent, the old units, in the y-axis. And you can see as people went from 800 meters or a mile all the way to the marathon, that lactate levels got much, much lower. This slide is the genesis of some of our thinking about the lactate threshold. Here's an individual record of a lactate threshold tracing or experiment from Pete Farrell's original study that I mentioned earlier. You can see treadmill velocity in meters per minute on the x-axis, and you can also see the change in blood lactate in millimolars on the y-axis. The yellow line is velocity versus lactate threshold, and the orange line is VO2 versus lactate. You can see that this individual didn't have much of a rise in their blood lactate levels until they started running around 268 meters per minute, and somewhere between 268 meters per minute, 295 meters a minute, I believe that's 10.5 to 11 miles per hour, blood lactate levels started to rise. And for this particular individual, that was about where their marathon pace was. This slide, again, just shows the relationship between lactate threshold and marathon speed, and it's to remind us of the relationship I described to you earlier. One of the really important things to remember is that with training, the lactate threshold increases from perhaps 50 or 60% of VO2 max all the way to 80% of VO2 max or greater. How does this happen? Well, this is a schematic of what happens when glucose is metabolized. It goes to pyruvate, and the pyruvate has two fates. It can go into the mitochondria where it's oxidized, or it can be shunted to lactate. What happens with training is shown in the next slide. With training, the number of skeletal muscle mitochondria can double. This was first shown by the late John Halazzi, who for many years worked at Washington University in St. Louis and is one of the giants in our field. And what happens when mitochondrial content doubles is that high levels of glucose can be converted to pyruvate, but that pyruvate can then be taken up by the mitochondria and oxidized, and only very little of the pyruvate goes to lactic acid. So we're now in a situation where we have an athlete with a very high VO2 max and a very high lactate threshold, high VO2 max from high stroke volume and cardiac output and red cell mass, high lactate threshold due to increased mitochondrial content in skeletal muscle. So this individual can sustain a very high absolute VO2 for a couple of hours. So the next question is, how fast can that individual move or run at that VO2? And that's where running economy comes into play. And it's simply asked how much speed can be generated at a given VO2. It's highly variable. there are biomechanical factors, including things like muscle and limb stiffness that play a role. Some people believe fiber type plays a role, and it's unclear if it's trainable, or certainly unclear how trainable it is. This is some data that I plotted in my original 1991 paper. I had gleaned running economy data from the literature, and also Jack Daniels had sent me some individual examples he had obtained over the years in true elites running at very high speeds. And I simply separated values into average, high, and low. And you can see that, for example, at 60 mLs per kg per minute, some individuals run 18 kilometers an hour, while other individuals can run 20 or perhaps even 21 kilometers an hour. So there is a lot of variability in running economy. And this means that at the same metabolic cost, one individual might be running 15% or more faster than another individual. The poster person for what good running economy can do for performance is Frank Shorter. Frank Shorter won the Olympic gold medal in the marathon in 1972 and got a silver medal in 1976. His VO2 max was very low for an elite athlete, barely 70 mLs per kg per minute. He likely had a very high lactate threshold, but he has some of the best running economy ever measured. In this slide, I made some hypothetical examples of Mr. Shorter. I assumed his VO2 max was 70 mLs per kg per minute, assumed his lactate threshold was 85% of VO2 max, and that his performance VO2 was 60 mLs per kg per minute. Assuming he had among the best running economy ever, that would lead to a predicted time of around 2:07. His best time was just over 2:10. And it should be remembered that his 2:10 was run in an earlier era, before races were set up to be fast, and before they were run early in the morning, and before pacemakers and prize money. So a pretty good guesstimate of how fast he would run based on these physiological variables. This next slide shows what happens with best ever values for VO2 max around 85 mLs per kg per minute, a lactate threshold of 85%, and a performance VO2 of 72 mLs per kg per minute. This works out to a 1:45 marathon, which is clearly way faster than breaking 2 hours. So it shows that there perhaps is some room for improvement. It also raises questions about whether very high values for VO2 max, lactate threshold, and running economy are somehow mutually exclusive, and how likely it is to find a single person with all of these values. One question that always comes up with superior athletic performance of any type is whether or not it's genetic. This is especially true in the current world, when there is so much interest in genetics in general, and also because East Africans are so dominant in distance running. One of my favorite things to ask audiences when I present live is, what about Kansas? And one of the questions is, are there more world record holders in the mile from Kenya or Kansas? Most people think it's Kenya, but in reality it's Kansas. And you see here Jim Ryan, Wes Santee, and Glenn Cunningham, all three world record holders in the 1,500 meters or mile from the University of Kansas. So I think before we make too many armchair assumptions about just because one ethnic group dominates a particular sport, or in this case distance running, that there's some obvious genetic explanation for it, we need to perhaps think again. This shows data from Rankin et al., and the title speaks for itself. No evidence of a common DNA variant profile specific to world-class endurance athletes. People can read the abstract here, but the important thing also to remember is that no variants related to blood volume, stroke volume, or hemoglobin, critical determinants of VO2 max, were identified. So again, while our common sense tells us that there's got to be something genetic about human performance, it's been very, very difficult to identify specific gene variants that explain much, if any, of the variability in performance. It's also important to remember that size can make a difference in athletic performance. The left panel shows us data from an array of elite Danish endurance athletes ranging from very large rowers who are nearly 100 kilos to cyclists and distance runners. You can see that there really isn't anybody as small as the average elite Kenyan distance runner. These men are about 56 kilos and only about 168 centimeters tall. You can also see that there's a relationship between body size and VO2 max in liters per minute. So it's important to remember that things as simple as size play an important role in athletic performance. This slide shows how the duration of stay at high altitude, in other words, how long someone has lived at high altitude, might influence their pulmonary diffusing capacity on the left axis. Pulmonary diffusing capacity is a measure of lung surface area, and higher pulmonary diffusing capacity would be a good thing for an endurance athlete. This shows that individuals who were born in Leadville, Colorado, had higher pulmonary diffusing capacity than individuals who moved there as adults, and provides some evidence that perhaps East Africans who were born at high altitude have a lifelong adaptation to high altitude that increases their pulmonary diffusing capacity. This, of course, would be an advantage for their oxygen consumption. It's also important to remember that East African children living at high altitude are probably more physically active than Western children. Next, I want to go over a little bit of history as it relates to the marathon in specific and distance running in general. A quick overview of the marathon tells us that Phidippides, the Greek messenger runner, ran from the plain of Marathon to Athens to report the victory over the Persians. He said, "We conquer." His achievement was commemorated in a Robert Browning poem in 1879, and it was an inspiration to Baron Pierre de Coubertin as he revivified the Olympics in 1896 at Athens. The original Olympic marathons were 40 kilometers, or about 25 miles. But in 1908 at the London Olympics, the British royal family wanted to see the start of the race, so it was moved 1.2 miles to Windsor Castle, making the total distance 26.2 miles. This figure shows the progression of world records for men and women in the marathon. Note the slow, steady decline in times for men over roughly 100 years or more, culminating in the outstanding performances by Eliud Kipchoge just prior to the pandemic. This experience was compressed for women because when women were permitted to run marathons starting in the 1960s and more commonly in the 1970s, they rapidly adopted the high mileage intense training programs that had been developed for men via trial and error over many, many years. This led to a rapid decline in record performance that was very stable with Paula Radcliffe's fast times in the early 2000s, and most recently the excellent performance of Bridget Koski a couple of years ago at Chicago. So let's think a little bit about what we know about VO2 max, where it came from, and some of the early data by Bruce Dill. Bruce Dill is on the left. He's perhaps the preeminent U.S. Exercise or work physiologist prior to World War II, and certainly into the 1950s and 60s. On the right is Don Lash, who was the first man to break 9 minutes for 2 miles. In the 1930s, Sid Robinson, working with Bruce Dill at the Harvard Fatigue Lab, brought in elite runners like Don Lash and Glenn Cunningham and made measurements of oxygen consumption at very fast running speeds. and essentially measured their VO2 max. And you can see here that Mr. Lash had a VO2 max of 76.4 mLs per kg per minute. His velocity of VO2 max was 360 meters per minute, and his world record velocity for 2 miles was 359 meters per minute. And this is consistent with later findings that velocity of VO2 max is highly correlated with 3,000 meter time. 2 miles is around 3,200 meters. So again, early evidence that velocity at VO2 max is a pretty good predictor of performance. People like Don Lash trained 4 or 5 days a week. They did some high-intensity training, but they rarely ran farther than 5 miles. And one of the things that's happened to make marathon running get a lot faster is that individuals have done more and harder training over the years. In the next few slides, we're going to discuss this and talk a little bit about what Pablo Nurmi did and compare that to Emil Zatopek, and then what followed. Around 1900, people like the great Alf Schrab ran 3 to 5 times a week. It was seasonal, the duration was less than 1 hour, and most of it was steady. They also ran a whole lot of races. By the 1920s, the Finns, led notably by Pablo Nurmi, were running or training 1 to 2 times per day year-round, sometimes greater than an hour, and this included walking, running, and sprints that looked something like current-day interval training. After World War II, the great Czech runner Emil Zatopek was training twice a day year-round for greater than 2 hours, and he was doing a lot of interval training. In fact, Zatopek sometimes ran 20 times 400 meters with a 200-meter jog, and even up to 60 times 400 meters with a 200-meter jog. So training became very hard, very prolonged, and very intense after World War II. By the middle 1960s, there were a number of schools of thought related to training. This shows the 1964 Olympic 5K. The winner was Bob Schul, who did the sorts of interval training that Zatopek did. Second place on the left was Harold Norpoth, who did nothing but long, slow distance training, hundreds of kilometers per week. Only a few of those kilometers per week were very fast. And on the far right is Bill Dellinger, who later became the track coach at the University of Oregon. And Mr. Dellinger did the sorts of training that most people use today, some intervals, some long runs, some threshold runs, really a mix. When you look at this data and you look at the tiny difference in performance among these 3 champions, it's led me to think about what I call the running haiku. And all you can say when you look at the pattern of training of elite athletes is that they run a lot of miles, some faster than your race pace, rest once in a while. So that's the running haiku. The other thing that happened in the 1960s was that more people began to participate in international competition. On the left, we see the great Abibi Bikila, the first black African to win an Olympic medal. He won the Olympic marathon in 1960 at Rome. And then you can see on the right, Kip Keino, multiple gold medal winner over a number of Olympic Games from Kenya, and really the first great Kenyan runner. This all happened in the 1960s and early 70s. The same has been true for women, where we have more women competing, women from all over the world competing, and the East Africans began to come onto the scene in the early 2000s and late 1990s and have been a force in women's distance running just as the men have. The other important thing to remember is that there's been more prize money as distance running has become professionalized. The races have become much better. Elite runners have much longer careers, and good runners move up from track races, the 5,000 and the 10,000, to the marathon much sooner, in part due to the financial incentives associated with winning major marathons. I had not thought too much about the 2-hour marathon since the early 1990s, and then in the early 2010s, time started to drop more. And Jonathan Reese, Alejandro Lucia, and I revisited some of the ideas in the 1991 paper in 2011. And we concluded that the person who broke 2 hours for the marathon would have an outstanding 10K time, good running economy, likely be very small, for the reasons I discussed earlier, and also because there are probably some thermoregulatory advantages to being small, and also some issues related to glycogen depletion that may come into play. This individual would have been involved in lifelong training, likely be a high altitude native, and would be in a race that included the right field, the right day, the right race or race course, and the right prize money scheme or set of incentives. In that 2011 paper, we looked at recent trends, made some regression lines, and thought that somewhere between the middle or early 2020s and the middle 2030s, someone might break 2 hours for the marathon in a race as currently conceived in 2011. In the next section, I want to talk a little bit about technology and innovation and briefly mention how doping might or might not have influenced things. So when you consider some of the ideas that I had raised in the early 1990s and that my colleagues and I had discussed in the 2010s, we thought that progress would be made toward a sub-2 hour marathon over a decade or so. In 2017, Nike simply said, why wait? And they came up with their Breaking 2 project. And in 2019, Ineos tried the Breaking 2 project essentially again. In both the 2017 Nike and 2019 Ineos efforts, led by Eliud Kipchoge, both groups looked for marginal gains. They looked for the right course, a good day in terms of temperature. They maximized the feeding of Mr. Kipchoge, and then they did everything they could to manipulate running economy, including drafting, pacing, and of course the Vaporfly shoes. And scientists played a key role in both efforts. Here you can see the drafting formation used in the 2017 Breaking 2 effort. In the 2019 Ineos effort, a different formation was used. However, drafting clearly played a key role. There are some terrific scientific papers on drafting. Here is one by Griffith Pugh, published in 1971. And the key point is that the energy cost of overcoming air resistance in track running may be 7.5% of the total energy cost at middle distance speeds and 13% at sprint speeds. Running 1 meter behind another runner virtually eliminated air resistance and reduced VO2 by 6.5% at middle distance speeds. And the speeds used in this paper were very similar to the speeds that Mr. Kipchoge was running. Before I get to the shoes, I want to also tell you that there have been efforts over the years to tune so-called running tracks so that the recoil or stiffness properties of the track were matched to the stiffness and recoil properties of the human leg. One of the first reports of this came in the late 1970s when a track was built at Harvard that was in fact tuned and led to improved performances by individuals running on that track. These performance improvements were on the order of 2 or 3%. Based on that old data on the track, what I like to tell people is that Nike essentially pulled the track and the shoe trick. The left-hand two shoes, or the left shoe and the center shoe, are typical running shoes, and the important thing to look at is the total deformation of the shoe and the differences between the two lines. So the shoe deforms them more, and 87% of the energy is returned with the Vaporfly, where only about 75 or 76% is returned with the Adidas shoe, and 65% with the typical Nike shoe. So the point here is that the stiffness of the shoe was manipulated, and that where there were no real springs in the shoe was tuned so that much more energy was returned and less was lost with each foot strike. I show this slide just to indicate that attempts to manipulate shoes are not new. This is an abstract from an early 1980s ACSM meeting that Roger Cram, the great biomechanics person at the University of Colorado, posted, and it just shows that there were efforts to attempt to manipulate running economy by the shoe companies 40 years ago. And there were reports that the at that time very novel Nike Air shoes did in fact improve running economy. This was never exploited to the extent of the more recent efforts, but it is interesting to note. Plates in shoes are nothing new either, and you can see here that Etonic had a plate in a shoe in the late 1990s. The data from the lab seemed to indicate that running economy was improved by about 4% with the new shoes. So the question then became, what happens to performance? So what Jack Sinefeld did, working with a number of colleagues, including Andy Jones, myself, and Sandra Hunter, is simply do what's called a match control study. So he took elite runners and who had races with and without the new shoes and compared their performances with and without the new shoes to other elite runners who did not change shoes or did not have access to the novel, quote, fast, unquote, shoes. And you can see for men, there was about a 0.8% improvement in performance with the new shoes, and for women it was about 1.6%. So these are clearly large improvements in performance. They would be worth a minute or more in an actual race, but they are not worth 4%, as you might predict based on the lab data. The other point I want to make is that shoe innovation was hiding in plain sight, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that next. In 2009, I gave a talk at Nike about the 2-hour marathon, and I asked about slap skates. A slap skate, or a clap skate, is a hinge skate. It permits better push-off and glide, and it revolutionized speed skating. And I simply asked, is there a parallel technology that could be invented in shoes? And I also pointed out that there might be some regulatory issues in terms of what's legal versus what is not legal. This figure simply is a schematic which shows a regular skate on the left and the clap skate on the right. The hinge provides really an extra lever for the skater, and that extra lever is what's responsible for the increased speed when individuals use clap skates. This historical photograph simply shows that people have been thinking about clap skates for a long time. This dates back to the early 1900s. If you think about other sports, efforts to improve efficiency or economy have also played a key role. On the left, we see the evolution of bikes. At the top, we see Eddie Merckx, the bike he used to ride almost 50 kilometers in 1 hour in the early 1970s. And then you can see the aero bikes and extreme body positions that were used to attempt to break those records. Bike technology was subsequently regulated, and bikes similar to Merckx were required for many years. More recently, aero bikes have been permitted. We can also think about things like the swimsuit shown on the right, or the so-called tech suit that led to a revolution in world record swimming performance a number of years ago. And again, those suits were also regulated, and we'll talk a little bit more about that next. Here are some interesting data on average finish times for the top finalists in the 100-meter freestyle for men at the Olympics. And you can see that times were a bit slower during the boycotts of 1980 and 84. Things got faster and faster. Then in 2008, there was a big drop due to the tech suits. And you can see that things began to come back to normal in 2012 and 2016 as the suits were regulated and full-blown tech suits were no longer allowed. So the question, of course, is when you look at the bikes and you also look at the tech suits, is should running shoes be regulated as well? Discussions about whether shoes should be regulated or banned are not new. This is a picture of a Puma brush bike from the late 1960s. These bikes were, in fact, banned prior to the 1968 Olympics. One of the interesting things to think about with breaking 2 in Ineos and the efforts of Eliud Kipchoge to break 2 hours is the extent to which this was contrived. And I think it's important to compare what Kipchoge did to what Roger Bannister did when he attempted to break 4 minutes for the mile. I want to point out that I understand the discussion about it being a contrived or manufactured event, but I think we do need to look at Roger Bannister's achievements in perspective. First, he was competing on a refurbished track at Oxford University, so it was state-of-the-art. He had 2 world-class pacers. He had custom-made shoes. He had state-of-the-art coaching from Franz Stapfel, and Sir Roger himself was involved in exercise physiology research as a medical student. Here you can see Bannister's 2 pacers. The man in the glasses is Chris Brasher, who won a gold medal in the steeplechase in 1956. The man in the right is Chris Chataway, who later was the world record holder at 5,000 meters and also broke 4 minutes for the mile. On the right, you see the pioneer coach Franz Stapfel in the cap. And in April 1954, Sir Roger ran 7 times 880 yards in 2:06. So he was certainly fit. His maximal oxygen consumption was measured, and it was close to 80 mLs per kg per minute. And here is just one paper of several that Roger Bannister did while a medical student on issues relevant to exercise physiology. So again, he had a state-of-the-art track, state-of-the-art shoes, pacers, state-of-the-art coaching, and state-of-the-art physiological input. I would be remiss if I didn't at least spend a little time on the role of doping in improved world records and human performance. This is analysis we did of top 10,000 meter times for men and how they've changed starting in about 1980 all the way till the middle 2000s. And what you can see here is that while the mean goes up, the distribution and the number of outliers really takes off in the middle 1990s and then tends to go down in the middle 2000s. Well, what happened in the middle 1990s is the emergence of EPO, and what happened in the middle 2000s was drug testing got better. Now, there's certainly plenty of erythropoietin use going on, and there's other sorts of doping going on. But the point here is that drug testing got a little bit better. And my guess is the reason is that there are fewer outlier performances, that because industrial strength doping has more or less stopped. So I don't believe for a minute that doping has stopped. And I believe there are all sorts of people microdosing out there. But I think the sorts of industrial strength doping we saw between the early and middle 1990s into the middle 2000s has mostly been suppressed. It's also important to think about psychology and to think about how someone like Eliud Kipchoge is able to put forth maximum effort and seem so relaxed at the same time. When you think about psychology, one of the classic old coaching maxims is that the will to win is not nearly so important as the will to prepare to win. So what do champions have to do? Daily training for many years. They have to have a willingness to accept feedback. They have to be resilient, and they have to be able to suffer. And when you think about what these elite athletes do, imagine running 20 times 400 meters with a 200-meter jog and doing those 400 meters in just over a minute each, or in some cases perhaps in 58 or 59 seconds. And people who've done those sorts of workouts will tell you that, among other things, it's an opportunity to come face-to-face with God. So these individuals train very, very hard and really learn to manage their suffering. For many years, though, it's been recognized that elite athletes, while they put forth great effort, are also able to relax and stay focused. This has been termed relax and win. This concept was developed by Bud Winter, the great coach at San Jose State University. Coach Winter was a physical educator, but one of the things he did during World War II was train fighter pilots. He noticed that individuals who were able to stay focused and relaxed while dogfighting had better outcomes. He adapted this concept to sports training, and of note, his coaching tree extends to Usain Bolt's coaches. Coach Joyner's ideas about relax and win predate ideas about the zone, mindfulness, yoga, just about every other thing related to staying focused and relaxed at the same time. Coach Joyner is a true pioneer. Here's what Coach Joyner had to say about relax and win. Demand perfection of yourself, and you'll seldom attain it. Fear of making a mistake is the biggest single cause of making one. Relax, pursue excellence, not perfection. This is a terrific message for athletes, but it's also a terrific general message for life. In this talk, we've covered issues ranging from physiology to sociology to history to my personal interest in the 2-hour marathon. So the question is, what do I think that's happened over the last couple of years that's allowed world records to fall, or at least world best performances to fall, and for Eliud Kipchoge to break 2 hours in an exhibition, and also for Bridget Koski to run a little bit over a minute faster than Paula Radcliffe's world record. So we'll try to put it all together now. In both cases, in terms of Kipchoge and Koski, we have terrific athletes. Especially in the case of Kipchoge, we've had a tuned course and an effort to really optimize the environmental conditions. My rough guesstimate is that pacing and drafting gets people about 2 minutes. Why do I say this? The prior women's world record was 2:15:25 by Paula Radcliffe, and that was set in a mixed race in the early 2000s, and she was helped along the way, or at least had men to pace her or draft off of for most of the race. If you look at her next fastest times, they're about 2 minutes slower. I estimate the shoes are worth about 80 seconds. This estimate is based on the fact that Kipchoge's best time in an open race without the shoes is around 2:03, and he ran 2:01:40 with the shoes. Similarly, Koski ran about 80 seconds faster than Paula Radcliffe's best time, and the only obvious difference was the shoes. So when I put it all together and consider the course, the pacing, the drafting, and the shoes, and try to put it all together, I come up with about a 3-minute improvement for a best ever runner like Eliud Kipchoge. So the question now is, what's next? I hope we can just do it in a real race. And again, I believe that the athlete who does this in a real race will have an outstanding 10K time, be a small person, be someone who's been subjected to lifelong training or high levels of physical activity, likely be an altitude native. And it will take the right field on the right day, at the right race, and the right prize money scheme to bring the great runners together so that the 2-hour marathon can be achieved in a real race. Thank you very much for your attention.